Good afternoon to you. I am Dr. James Smith Jr., and welcome back to another edition of the Dr. James Show. Hope you had a phenomenal weekend and that your week has gotten off to a compelling, great, purposeful start. As we continue Black History Month, our shows this month will have that theme as we continue to tell the narrative of our incredible professionals. Today, we have the honor of having with us Patti DeRosa. Patti is the president and founder of ChangeWorks Consulting, focusing on the following: DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-racism, organizational change, social justice and education, equity-centered leadership, and you name it. We have a treat. Trust me, she's also a songwriter, guitarist, singer, one of my best friends. Welcome to the Dr. James Show, Patti DeRosa. Great to have you.
Hey, James, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing
here.
well. How are you doing these days?
I'm doing fabulous.
All right.
Good.
Let's dive in right away.
I'm ready to dive.
What is a girl who was born and raised in New York City,
Yeah.
and who lived in Boston for a number of years, now living in Florence, Italy? How did that happen? And I believe you have dual citizenship, so do tell.
Sì, okay, buonasera, it's the afternoon here, so parlo un po' italiano per tutti, I'll speak a little Italian. I'm looking at these photos, I'm getting distracted there. So my journey to Italy, my family, I'm Italian-American, and now I say also Italian and American because of the citizenship, and Italian-American is quite different than being Italian, to be honest. But I was born in Brooklyn in an immigrant community. My grandparents, all four of my grandparents came from Italy. Not my parents were born in the US, but I lived there, then lived on Long Island for most of my growing up. And then went to undergraduate school in upstate New York, eventually made my way to Boston for graduate school. Been back to Boston for 30 some odd years and moved here to Italy in 2015. But that journey was all tied up in, like I said, being Italian-American, working class family, white, coming up in the 60s and 70s where I was old enough to have been profoundly influenced by the social justice movements, but young enough to have not have really been there, if you know what I mean, like a little too young to. But all that part is formative, and I think we'll get more into that. But that's sort of my path to Italy, was that eventually I did get dual citizenship, which is based on a fairly unfair and I would say racist social policy here, and I'll talk about that later. But because of one of my grandfathers never became a US citizen, that allowed me to get citizenship here. So once all those things shifted and I was tired of the New England winters, so here I am.
Here we are. Patti, I read where you said you are loving the land, the language, and the culture of your ancestral heritage, expanding your understanding of racism and white supremacy. Say more about that.
Oh, that's a long conversation. So I guess if I kind of rewind to the early coming up, right? That for me, with all those identities, white, working class, Italian American, and seeing what the social changes that were happening around me, and being in New York, which prided itself on so-called liberalism, but yet I looked around my world and it didn't look real different than what the fingers that were pointing down south. So for me, it propelled me to ask a lot of questions, right? Because my neighborhood, white folks say predominantly white community. That's not white folks code, right? It's really all white, and there's reasons for why it was all white. So I started asking those questions, and that propelled me when I was in undergraduate school, taking courses in what was then called Black Hispanic Studies, eventually getting advanced degrees in African American Studies. So my whole framework, well, again, I think in further questions, we'll get more into this, was transformed to understanding how systemic racism worked and functioned. So now, fast forward, here I am in Italy, and Europe in general, and trying to understand these same issues, because they're rooted in European colonialism, right? And the racial hierarchy of white supremacy that began here and fine-tuned in the US, and looking at those parallels and intersections. So I feel like I'm taking all this knowledge I have, but getting so much new inputs and new perspectives on how that plays out.
Hey, Patti, did in order for you to get into DE&I work, diversity,
Yeah,
equity,
yeah,
inclusion
yeah.
work, was
Mhm.
there an ongoing successions of events that you saw that motivated you? Is there something that was it Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or is it just something that
Yeah,
you
sure.
felt that something was wrong, something was not equal, there was a lack of inclusion, and you
Mhm.
decided then to pursue this
Right.
journey?
Yeah. So I guess I would frame it first that the whole DEI nomenclature came much, much later. My entry and my passion and my focus in the work is around anti-racism and racial justice. And that's really important. DEI is a broader inclusive umbrella, and it makes connections and intersections between different forms of oppression. But my entree and my baptism in fire was clearly through looking at racism. And again, that hypocrisy I saw around me in New York. I started noticing how, there were no kids of color, very few, or maybe one or two in my neighborhood, finding out that it wasn't an accident that was that way.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly watching, again, being very young during that time period of 68 when Dr. King was assassinated, but hearing about that, looking at the TV, seeing the injustice. I didn't grow up in a particularly progressive family. I wouldn't say that in this sense. I grew up in an open and loving family, and it wasn't the kind of family where you heard racial epithets, but there was also very little racial consciousness and understanding. So that there's something about that in there. But again, looking at what I saw around me and how it didn't match up. And I think another piece, as I'm talking, in my junior high years, my family and I, we moved to South Florida for a while, Hollywood, in between Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And although the neighborhoods were still segregated, the school I went to, the high school and middle school, had recently been court-ordered desegregated, which was more than I can say for my school in New York, which is still as segregated as it was decades ago. And so then moving in a space where I was in a multiracial school, having to push and test what I thought my own values and beliefs were, right? Because before it was more like, oh, I think this, but now I'm really interacting with people. And at some point, I remember some teachers pulled me into what were the early days of like race relations workshops. And somebody was a student leader in that regard. So that kind of pushed me into it. But I was only there for 9th and 10th grade. And then we went back to New York to the same community I had left. And at that point, the hypocrisy and contradictions were so loud and in my face that, but from a very young age, Jim, I asked questions. My mother tells me I started asking questions about race as young as 5 years old.
Wow. I see where you have your master's in African American Studies.
One of my masters. I have a dual degree in a master's in social work and a master's in African American studies. It's why I went to Boston. They offered a dual degree program so I could work on 2 masters at the same time. Yeah.
Wow, 2 at the same time. Go to the chat room. It says, how did living in Boston shape your understanding of and commitment to racial justice? You talked about the role New York played, but how did living in Boston for the number of years you did shape your understanding and commitment to racial justice?
In similar ways of being from New York. James, you and I have traveled all around the country, and people are always saying, oh, it must be so tough down south. I said, oh no. The hardest workshops I've ever done have been in New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. Very often.
What made them the most challenging? What type of participants did you deal with?
Yeah, so to tie that into that question around Boston, Boston certainly has a well-earned reputation as being very racist, but I feel like we use that, as Malcolm X says, anywhere south of the Canadian border, right? So there's different versions of how that plays out. And I think in the Northeast, there was that more, because Boston's got multiple personalities, right? There's we have all the universities and the medical center and the Kennedys and blah, blah, blah. And then we have this rough and tumble sort of very racist. And both those things are true. And doesn't mean the Kennedy part wasn't racist as well. I think all those things are linked together. So I'm not sure if that's addressing the person who asked the question, but certainly one way it helped me in a very positive way is that I was really in the right place and the right time, because a lot of the innovative work around anti-racism that we rely on now came out of Boston during that time in the 70s and 80s. So the book, This Bridge Called My Back, and like some of the writers from there, and the Combahee River Collective, that was like one of the first Black feminist statements, was a collective of people who I actually got to work with was mentored by. There were other key players around the birth of the Rainbow Coalition movement before it went national, came out of Boston. There's just so many of those movements, intersectionality and the conversations about that. And I was just blessed to be in Boston. So where there was all the negatives, that also fueled this movement kind of, so that helped.
Ooh, let's stay in the chat rooms.
Yeah.
Knowing that you have taught at a number of universities, you're true educators, as thinking of universities like Temple, who pride themselves in their diversity, at the same time as those admission numbers are dwindling, where do you think universities miss the mark where it comes to diversity?
Interesting you say that. Okay.
So in essence, where do you think, bottom line, where do you think universities who pride themselves on creating an inclusive culture and an environment, where are they missing the mark when it comes to diversity?
So I would say it's universities, it's workplaces and companies, it's schools, it's healthcare. It's pretty much the same conversation. First is, I'd like them to be clear about what they mean by diversity, right? Because that's often code for racial diversity, which is often code for needing more people of color representation, right? But folks, first of all, should speak honestly and clearly about what they're talking about. That's number one. And the way it gets encoded means they're not doing the work. And I think for me, when I work with a client, I rarely, if ever, will go in to do a workshop or a talk on diversity. Because I want to know what are they doing systematically in that organization to get different outcomes, right? It's coming to what Kendi talks about now around the difference between racist and anti-racist. It's like, what are the policies, attitudes, and behaviors? If the policies aren't in place to transform the outcome, we're really just doing a lot of talking. So I see that a lot with universities as well, that there's a lot of talk about diversity, which is like the who shows up at the party.
Sure.
But not a lot of talk around whose party is it anyway, and who's setting the rules of this party. So yeah.
What would they have to do? What would be some of the first steps in order to, as I like to say, is what's in the window in the store? You may espouse, we have this, we have that, but is there representation in making the decisions as well?
Right. So I think one is, again, under that broad arc of diversity is looking at, so a school might be doing much better, let's say, on women's leadership and, or, you know, representation of women, maybe not so much in leadership, maybe yes, or around LGBT issues, LGBTQ issues, but maybe not so good on race issues, good on some racial issues, but not on others. So I think a real strategic plan of narrowing in of what's your desired outcome, what would the ideal university look like? And then you roll back, how is this tied into our hiring, our retention? How is it tied into curriculum? What about our faculty? What about our student affairs? It's looking at it from a macro perspective, it's a systemic perspective, as opposed to a couple of little, you know, little pockets of things. So that feels much more, I mean, we do days and days and days of strategic planning to get to that, but.
We're going to go deeper in this conversation, but I want to take a time out and dive quickly into your singing and your songwriting and your guitar work. We're going to play an excerpt from one of your many videos of you singing and doing what you do best. Let's take a look at Patti D singing a little bit outside.
So we're going to start off with a song that's really about women, and for all mis sorelle, mi hermosas, mis sisters who are here today. Here we go in all languages. 1, 2. This is what I offer. Take me as I am. This is what I offer. Take me as I am. I'm a complicated woman. Oh yeah. Simple and I'm complex. Yeah, I'm basic and extreme.
Okay, you do your research. I didn't send you that one.
I'm reckless and I'm cautious. I'm something in between. What was the motivation behind that song? And what was the motivation behind you, your foray into music?
Sure. So when I want to acknowledge the guy on the congas, that's a guy named Phil Punch from Massachusetts. And that was at a festival called Eve Rising, which was a celebration of women in music. And I got to kick off the event. So I started playing guitar when I was 13 years old, again, coming up in that phase when there was James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, really influenced by the Beatles and Motown earlier, but in terms of the guitar players. And mostly self-taught, but through friends and learning and sitting in the front row with James Taylor. You know. But I started performing right away, actually, and was writing songs very soon.
Really?
Having something to say. You know, early on, it was more the motivation, like for many young singers, songwriters, particularly young women, you know, love, heartbreak. You get great art from pain, right? I would say.
Yeah.
I released a CD called the Tortured Love Song Edition, you know. So there's all those, but for me now, it's, you know, it's around other types of life and growth and self-development, looking at my experiences, looking at other people's experiences, trying to turn them into stories and lessons. Obviously, politics has influenced that. So you had some pictures that's from Florence, it's from Italy. There's a picture there from Costa Rica. So that kind of played all over the place. Wow. And I think, James, I think you know this. I also, for a period, played in a Caribbean steel drum band. Not guitar, I actually played the steel drums. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, music's just part of my heart, my passion, and it's great, you know, we need that joy.
Does it drive or impact your work in any capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a period where I tried to keep it separate because the social justice work was so all-consuming. And so the music was a release, you know, but there are certainly times, and you see that from some of my songs, where I integrate that in. And when I'm doing more concerts as opposed to bar gigs, you know, at a concert where you can really do storytelling, I integrate them much more. So.
I love it. I love it. Now, to go from singing and songwriting and playing the guitar, you have said you're a social justice advocate.
Yeah.
What goes into someone being a productive advocate? What qualities, what skills, what mindset does one need in order to be, you know, a successful advocate?
You know, when you said that, the first word that comes to mind is being humble. And because when I say advocate, it sounds like I'm speaking up for something else. I guess something I didn't say at the beginning was that part of the journey, particularly around anti-racism and racial justice, is that I began to understand that racism in the United States was part of my story. It wasn't somebody else's story.
How so?
Because we're in a society that's built on racial hierarchy. It was built into the DNA of the country. No one remains neutral in a system like that. So if racism has shaped and impacted people of color's life, that same system has shaped and impacted my life as a white person. Same thing with sexism. Men and women were caught, men, women, and other identities, but in using that binary for a moment, is that patriarchy sets expectations and lifts men up, but also creates limitations, right? So I'm very much into the philosophy of folks like Heather McGhee, who wrote the Sum of Us, and also Jonathan, many writers have written about this, Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness, that this system is toxic for all of us in it. And so when we're in it, it's all of our struggle to become healthy, whole, inclusive. So the system's targeted people of color in vastly different ways than it affects white people. But I tell people this in Europe all the time, virtually everything that you look at in the United States that's not working, if you peel back the onion, it comes back to the original sin of racism. Heather McGhee frames it this way: why can't we have nice things? Because it always comes back to this battle between who's determined to be worthy and who's not. So understanding that big picture, and that we all have a role in this, and we all are impacted by this, like no one's, that becomes really important. Attitudes, knowledge, and skills, self-awareness, being courageously self-reflective, being willing to take criticism and feedback as a gift and not as a hurtful thing. Knowledge, James, you know me, I'm the resource queen. Read. Don't stop ever reading, learning. The more we read and learn, that's really important. And then the skill set is, we can have all the awareness and knowledge, but do we have the skills, the tactics to be able to do that effectively in ways that are healing and not more harmful or that replicate the very thing we think we're
Patty, do
challenging.
you think we could dismantle this system, or what needs to happen in order for this system to be dismantled, to be edited, to be reshaped, to create a renaissance in our society? Is that possible?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I think I'll come in two parts. The visionary, I don't even want to say optimist, but the visionary means that if we created a system, we can dismantle a system. So that we have to believe in the possible. I was watching a really interesting talk around this last night, that if we get stuck in a vision of history of either it's life, actually, it was someone who wasn't talking about Dr. King, but was talking about that arc of moral justice, Islam bends towards justice. And what this person, he wasn't critiquing King, but he was saying this idea of like progress moves forward in a good way all the time. And he's like, history, not always. You know, so the question is, that arc may bend, but we're the ones who have to bend it. So that means our own agency, there's that possibility. Will I see it in my lifetime, your lifetime? No, I think the system is very complex. I've come to, the more I'm abroad, is seeing the struggle against racism, xenophobia as one part of a much larger picture now in a different way. That's some of what I'm seeing happening at the international level around democracy and totalitarianism. These things all fit underneath. So do I think it's possible? Yes. Do I think it's likely in my lifetime's getting shorter? No. But I also know the legacy of all those who came before us. We stand on the shoulders of those ancestors. And so our obligation is to keep moving forward. And this is my real optimistic piece. Although I believe there are very powerful forces that benefit economically, spiritually, all these other ways from this system for their own benefit, I believe that we're in those who want more equity and justice are in the majority. That doesn't mean we're mobilized and have the techniques to do that, but yeah, that's sort of why I come down on it. So,
Patty, did you ever get so frustrated where you said, I'm tired, I'm going to go do something else, I'm going to go play music full time, I'm going to go get a corporate gig, I'm just all this activism, all this social justice, all this working to get people to understand what's happening right now? The system's not benefiting from everyone. Did you ever get to a point where you just said enough is enough? This session was too hard. This person, I'm not getting anywhere. I
sound like I have this duality all the time. Exhaustion, yes. Saying I can't do it, no. Because when I get to that point, and now at this point in my life, have I reshaped how much I step in, how much I step out? But whether the work is formally in the actual doing workshops, training, I think there's other ways to engage. So, but I kind of think sometimes when I get that feeling is the arrogance of me. All that's being asked from me is to talk and engage and have sometimes difficult conversations. But that's not a big ask, given what's going on and what many, many people experience and what this system has done to all of us in our society. So that keeps me going, is to know that, you know, no matter how small, whether it's a personal conversation or a more formalized work. And the other thing is, I want to say this to people who are listening. I mean, James, you and I often do specifically DE&I work.
Yeah.
Wherever your job is, there's the opportunity to bring this consciousness and these things into our workplaces. It's not just teaching about it, it's actually living and doing it. And I actually think that's the much harder work. So I applaud people who maybe come to our sessions and say, how do I apply this in the day-to-day job that I have when I see it real time? Because that's the work too. It just isn't as sexy activist in the same sort of way, but that's the work, right? The real transformation.
Speaking of activism, we have a couple of pictures of you doing your activism work or with some famous advocates. Let's take a look at, I think you out there with your blowhorn, making it happen.
That's in Italy, yeah.
That's in Italy, okay. What was this session, movement? Talk to us about what's happening here.
That looks like we were at the US consulate. I think that was right, it may have been right after Trump's election, that one, where a lot of us showed up and talked about not in our name, and yeah.
How about this one right here? I believe it's a picture of you with the famous Angela Davis. Where did this occur? Where were you guys at? Let's take a look.
So that's with Angela Davis, and on the other side is my dear friend, Fran Smith, sometimes known as Francesca. Big shout out to her, because I know she's going to watch this. Yay. One of the strongest white anti-racist activist sisters and dear friends in the entire world. She's brilliant. So Angela Davis, we happen to share a birthday. I'm thrilled about that. And it was at an event in Boston that was focusing on a youth organization that was doing social justice work. And she was there as a speaker. And so we got to chat with her a little bit afterwards. So I was thrilled.
Powerhouse, little Mount Rushmore there, huh?
Yeah, it's awesome.
Let me ask you this one. Patti, how has your identity as a white woman influenced your work?
Right. So I think I tried to speak to that a little bit before, in that a shift happened when I remember at one point I was in college and this is after I was like, oh, I'm the anti-racist, blah, 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 blah. But it was still outward focused. And I think this happens a lot for us, those of us who are white, is we can start to see the targeting and oppression of people of color, but somehow still think, again, we're in this neutral position, and starting to put the mirror back. And the assignment was, what does it mean to be white, right? And so starting to understand and deconstruct whiteness has been really, really important. Because again, that's an experience too. What did it mean that I grew up in an all-white community?
What does that mean?
So what that means is that I move in a world where I have the luxury, as I think of it, as a liability, to not necessarily see what's going on around me, right? I mean, that's one of the privileges of whiteness, right? It's the privileges of any dominant group. Men don't have to see, they can see the little snippets of sexism, but not really look at how men may benefit from that system. Same thing with people who are heterosexual, any of these isms. So I think we can sometimes just think of our lives as just is, like, oh, I lived in my neighborhood and it just was white. Well, it wasn't just, there was a whole series of things that created that outcome. So nothing just is. So that feels really important. I think my whiteness has illuminated some aspects of racism from an insider perspective of a white person, since white people created and maintain this system. There's a way of engagement as a white person and engaging with white people. But of course, it also obscures some things, because there's some things, parts of racism that isn't my lived experience. I can learn, study history, but I haven't lived and experienced certain things. On the other hand, I have lived and experienced what it means to be a white person. So, and done a lot of thinking about it. So that, there's, in the same way that men sometimes can be particularly effective dealing with men around patriarchy and sexism, it's the same thing. I think there's parallels with different isms like that. So it's shaped me in profound ways. And I think my Italian Americanness, this is also true a bit in Italy, that Italian Americans are clearly white by US history standards, but we're also sort of what I call the marginal white folks. Like, you're in the club, like, you're not like the real white folks, like the real Anglo-English German folks, but just, and I see that playing out here in different ways. So a good friend of mine, Angelica Pezzarini, brilliant professor of sociology here, says, Italians are both racialized and racializers. So in some contexts, they get racialized, seen as the other is less than, and other ways, and clearly in terms of broader white supremacy, we're part of the white club. There's no two ways about that. So that status has given me some insight too, I think.
Have you ever felt any fear in doing this work?
Have I what?
Any fear in doing this work? Ever feel threatened? Did any of those participants or people out on the street ever give you that eye that they would rather you be doing something else?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, those are kind of the tires that go with the car in some ways. In terms of being like physically threatened around the work, no, I mean, I have had sometimes in workshops, I could think of a couple of sessions in particularly, where white male participants have gotten particularly confrontational and arrogant and aggressive.
How did you handle that?
Around race as well as gender. So an example is, laugh about it now. I was working for it wasn't my own contract. I was working for another organization. So it was, my curriculum was limited, what I could do out of this. And there was this one, it was almost all white. It was a corporate situation, almost all white guys. And I was putting up a bell curve about something. I think it was around whatever it was, like one side's lower, the other. And no matter what I did, this guy would like I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I'm like, I didn't put any data up yet. It's just a picture, like what's not to agree, you know?
Sure.
And I said, just trust me, let me get there. And what this guy said to me, he goes, the last time I trusted a woman, I ended up with a baby. And so I just took a deep breath and I looked right back at him. That, like, I almost lost it. I was facilitated by myself and I looked at him. I said, well, there's no danger of that happening here now, is there? He was not happy.
That was good.
Reported me to my superiors about da 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 da. But he was really like when I left, like, again, following me around, that kind of intimidation. I've experienced that kind of stuff. I've had another situation like that with men, in a sense. And anti-racism work, particularly, I did get followed home. This is early in my thing. Was I was right out of undergraduate school. I spoke out about some blatant racism happening in my community, where a group of white neighbors were trying to block a Black family from purchasing a home. So I reported it to the local anti-discrimination agency. I wrote a letter to the newspaper. I do all the things that you do when you're 22 and on fire. And yeah, and I was playing music at the time, and someone followed me home very late at night, and I knew they were following me. Interesting enough, I've rethought this later. What I did on the way home, after I realized they were following me, was that I stopped at the police department. And what I realized later, of course, is that, and then even here it was, I was being followed, harassed because of my stance on anti-racism, but the fact that I felt safe enough to go to the police department was an aspect of my white privilege that protected me even in that moment. And then they also graffitied in my driveway, and we had to have, it was a whole big thing. Yeah, so there's been those kinds of things, but that's, that realization for myself, that the fact that going to the police was even an option, framed it. And so I think that's important for any of us who are white, is to remember, even as we fight racism, we still don't lose the perks and benefits of white privilege. They're with us.
You have some people, Patti, who will say, white people who will say, I have no privilege. I worked hard. I pulled myself up from my bootstraps. Nothing was ever given to me. I don't believe in this privilege stuff. What do you say?
Okay, so I think that's a challenge to us who do this work, because I think when we throw a word around like privilege around, people here born with a silver spoon in your mouth. And so sometimes I'll break it down. So like, you may have been dirt poor, work for everything you had, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I might add, at least you had some boots, other people don't. But I think all that's true. And I think we don't validate that. And we have to acknowledge that, no, life may not have been easy, but the barrier wasn't your race. So what were the perks that went with that, right? So my own family, you know, working class, just first little steps into the middle class, was able to get whatever, like the GI Bill loans that, you know, folks of color in the same position couldn't get, that let them get their little house. What didn't mean they weren't working hard. It meant there was, I use the phrase grease on my wheels. There was grease that was still helping it. And so I think sometimes if I break down privilege to advantage, assets, help, and then give examples of things, like how many of us even know how the FHA loan process happened and how that went to 97% went to white families. Most of us who are white don't know that, you know? So if you don't know it, you think all you see is the hard work, which is also true. But that's the piece we got to validate, because there is a truth to that. And when we frame it as life is easy for you and it's just hard, we're going to lose the conversation, because it's not actually accurate, right? But in terms of race, yes, there's all sorts of advantages that are built in a system for folks like me.
Talking about advantages, I believe I am the way I am because of some of the people that have been in my life. We're going to show a picture of you and I think some folks who played a key role in your life. We're going to some throwbacks. Let's take a look at these throwback pictures and let me know.
Oh my goodness.
Have played a role, and tell us who they are and the role they played in your life.
Mamma mia, you're gonna make me cry. So would you go on my Facebook page or something, man? Okay. I'm lucky those are the only ones you chose, I guess. So the one with the 4 men, my father is in the middle on the top. And those are my uncles. This is gonna sound like a bad stereotype. Uncle Petey, Uncle Johnny, and Uncle Tony. And my father was Frank. And on the other side is me and my dear mother, Norma. We were on a boat called the Ernestina. I was running a youth program for kids, a multiracial youth group in Boston, where we went on this boat.
You're looking at her so admiringly. You're like,
yeah,
that's my mom.
Yeah. I miss them, but both of my parents are gone, so I just really feel it. Yep.
How about your father, the role he played in your life? I have a special relationship with my daughter. I was wondering, were you guys really close, or did you talk, or did he talk about DE&I work, or?
No, well, no, not, okay, so my dad died when I was very young. He died when I was 18.
Wow.
So I was just starting to find my voice, although I do remember, and I have an article I wrote about this called Building Blocks, My Journey Towards White Racial Awareness, probably sent it to you years ago, where my dad's family was more stereotypically and actually more, if I did hear racist things, it was from that side of the family than my mother's side of the family, to be honest. And it was more the throwaway comments kind of stuff. And as I started finding my racialized voice, and talking about the injustice I was seeing, my father would sort of play my foil a bit at the dinner table, but not in a way that shut me down. And I've come to understand that it actually helped me build some verbal agility to deal with someone who, because I knew he respected me enormously and would support whatever choice I made in my life. So I feel certain about that. And that's not to romanticize or excuse some of the things that I did hear from him. But, you know, he came from that, he talked about growing up poor, nothing on your plate, rough and tumble, East New York, you know, relatives involved, probably who knows involved in what in the old days to make ends meet. I think that was hard for him. But again, I was so young, it's really hard to know how much is reality and fantasy with my dad at this point. Yeah. So.
I wonder what he would say if he heard you singing the next song. Let's see some more of Patti DeRosa. Okay. Let's take a look.
I'll never know how much I love you. You'll never know how much I care. When you throw your arms around me, I get a fever that's so hard to bear. You give me fever, yeah. When you kiss me, fever. When you hold me tight, say fever, I'm on fire. Fever all through the night.
We'd like it. I mean, that's an old Peggy Lee song, so it's probably back in the day, you know. That was at we probably had a couple before that one.
You're feeling good, huh? You're feeling good.
Yeah.
Great song. You extremely talented. Patti, let me ask you this. What do you think is critical for white people who are challenging racism to know? What's critical for them to know, those who are challenging the racism that exists?
Let me think about this. I know I wrote down some notes because I want to make sure I hit them. So I'm going to go. I think I told you I wrote my notes so small I can't read them anymore.
But I find that there are events that happen in our society. Events stimulate a certain level of let's come to the rescue, and then it subsides, it stops.
Okay, so here's what I think. To start with, a profound, I would call it going from the world is flat to the world is round moment for me was once I had got an understanding of systemic racism. Before that, my understanding was the way the word racism is colloquially used, or when we say you're such a racist, what we mean is personal prejudice, personal racial prejudice. And I think that's how I framed it because I didn't have any other framing, you know, to understand it. And in undergraduate school, again, I've been blessed with wonderful mentors and teachers, and particularly many African-American mentors and teachers who took me under their wing when I suspect I was quite annoying in my young curiosity, but saw something in me. So that idea of that it's just personal prejudice versus, you know, the definition we use now, prejudice. I know we use prejudice because power is shorthand, but I actually think we need to say prejudice plus systemic power backed up by historical legacy that have far-reaching impacts on people's lives, all those things together. So I think the personal prejudice is like a flat map. It can get you around the neighborhood, but you can't get any further on it. You're gonna fall off the end sooner or later. And to navigate this broader globe of an issue, we really need this systemic analysis. So that's one that's really critical for white people. Two is what I spoke with earlier around understanding that this isn't somebody else's issue. This is our issue as white people. That as white people, we've been racialized in society as everybody else, and it has ramifications. So we need to see what our part on this stage is. I think that's really, really critical. Shift in definition, individual, that we have to work on not shaming and blaming. None of us created this system, but we certainly stepped onto the stage. And so we have accountability and responsibility, not just out of obligation, because that's can very easily tip over into saviorism, which just reinforces the white supremacy. I can help you. We'll talk more about that. But out of integrity, what's the kind of world I want? If I want a world where I say I want equity and justice and fairness and all these things, then what do I have to do to help make the world that way? What do I have to do inside myself and not be fearful of those, like, oh, I learned that stuff. How do I unlearn that? As well as working with others. So that's really important. I think the humbleness is really important. And I said that comes down to remembering that we're all learning and have more to learn. I sometimes get concerned for some of the way I see dialogues are going now. And I'm not talking about with necessarily the camp that may be more resistant to the message, but even within the movement, a lot of jumping on each other as if we popped out of the womb knowing what we knew. Like, we're all going to make mistakes. That's part of the process, right? So how do we help each other learn and grow? That feels really important. And knowing the history.
With that, let's stay
I
with
just want
that.
to add before we go on, just knowing the history. There's no shortcut to that, and that just takes study and research and immerse yourself. Yeah.
Doing the work.
Well, the study of real history to understand. You can't, a lot of people are shocked when they see some of these. It's like, well, of course you're shocked because you didn't know it. And if you didn't know it, I see why you might have come to these conclusions you came to, because you didn't have enough information to understand. So sorry to interrupt you, James.
No. What do you say to the well-intentioned, good person, white person who very nice, communicates well, very responsive, a great citizen who doesn't understand the furor, the anger, the stress that many and underrepresented groups have in terms of getting them to become more of an advocate, beyond ally. What's the conversation there? What's the narrative there?
I actually just wrote an article about that, as you know, that I sent you. Right? So I think of Dr. King's quote around, sometimes he's more concerned around the well-intentioned as opposed to the overt racist that can, like, it's too soon, I can't speak up, I can't do all that sort of timidness. So that's one piece. But I think I would start from a place, one is around that well-intentioned is a good place to start, right? That's better than like, I don't want things to change. At the same time, it's like I say, love is not enough. Love is profound, right? But it's like a doctor. If I'm going in for surgery, I want a doctor who's well-intentioned, who's kind, who's caring, who's got great bedside manner. But he better know his stuff around that surgery before I go into that knife, right? Because otherwise it's going to hurt somebody. Right. And I think that can happen for us around this issue, that we have all this compassion and love for other people. And sometimes I'll use that because I know you're that person. And this works, of course, if I'm being authentic with someone. If someone's not that person, it's a different conversation. But because I know you're that kind, caring, loving, compassionate person, I know you want to do things that are going to help us move in the right direction. So what if you tried on to see that some of the stuff that you and myself may be doing may actually be undermining the very thing we say we want? It's like this, we have values and behaviors, and we have to get them in sync. Sometimes we say these are our values, but we want to hold on to these behaviors.
Yes.
And then we got a choice. Either we have to face that, oh, if these are really my values, I have to change these behaviors. Or if I'm really committed to keeping these behaviors, then I have to own up to that the values I've always said I had may not be the values I really believe. So, and that's true with any issue, not just around anti-racism, right? It's how do we get, authentic and genuine with ourselves, right?
I love it. I love it. Patty, I'm going to put you in a hot seat right now.
Oh, God.
I'm going to go in the hot seat. With the hot seat, I give you a word, and you give me the first word that comes to your mind. Okay. This is a talk to think, not a think to talk exercise.
Let's see where it goes.
This is no more than 1 minute. Here you go. Your first word is inclusion.
Not enough.
Equity.
Getting better, right?
Race.
Complex.
Leadership.
Essential.
Collusion.
Everyone.
Jane Elliott.
Awesome.
Advocacy.
Voice.
family,
Love.
authenticity,
Real.
communication.
Everything.
Patty D, you're off the hot seat. You're off the hot seat. Another question for you. What are some of the similarities and or differences with how we understand racism in the US compared to perhaps in Florence, Italy, and places you've been?
Yeah. So this is really interesting. I've done a lot of thinking about this the last few years. And that there are things from the US experience that can really illuminate things here, because the US has been working on it longer and harder, but it's not the same experience. And so I have to be mindful that that very ethnocentrism we always talk about on the US side, guess what? We can practice it as Americans when we impose our models of how things happen over here. So that's been humbling. So one is that we have to remember that the story is rooted in the same foundations, in the sense that the hierarchy of white supremacy, Aryan supremacy came out of Europe, right? The history of colonialization, taking over and conquering, and other nations, particularly Africans, South Pacific, Asians, and South America, all around the globe, right? What that history is the same. This history of enslavement, when we think about a difference here, so think about the US was founded and created in inequality. It was written into the script from the founding documents, which, by the way, for anyone who's listening, that's all critical race theory is thinking. It's written in the law. That's what it means. It's looking at the laws. And from the earliest days, that was written into it, right? So that it's in the DNA, when I say that, of the founding of the nation. And the atrocities of that happened on that land right there, right? So people were living right next to enslavement, genocide, conquering of what was formerly Mexico right there. Europe, on the other hand, may have had this ideology and then exported its atrocity. In the sense that the colonial escapades happened in other countries. So they created this whole fantasy of, we're doing it to help. I mean, it's really amazing when I've gone deeper. I think Kendi talks about this in Stamped, but that the repercussions of that system often were out of sight, out of mind. So there's a distance and a denial from it. So that's a big difference. And that also that European nations existed before colonialism and empire, and had identities before. I mean, there were other, the Roman Empire, all these things before, but the birthing of it wasn't based on this newer system of racial hierarchy. So that the founding stories are really important. Another thing I've noticed is that in Italy in particular, there's a minimization. Italy didn't, in the sense of like the Dutch or the British or the Belgians, for example, Belgians, that colonized many, many nations all across the planet. Italy came to the colonial game later, in the early 1900s in North Africa and Eritrea and Ethiopia, and don't call it colonialism. It's sort of like the Vietnam War wasn't called a war, but it was. This on the book wasn't colonialism, but it was. And it was tied to the rise of Mussolini and the racial laws and all that stuff of Italy, again, trying to prove itself in the racial club. And the way we do that is to conquer Africa. So again, that's a little different story. And there's a thing here, whereas in the US, there's we're the United States, we're the land of freedom, the home of, all that mythology that has some truth, but there's a myth to it. Same here, there's something called the brava gente, we're the good people. So we're not like those Dutch, we're not like the Spaniards, but so that gets in the way of the conversation. And the last thing I would say about this is that I think in the US, because aside from indigenous peoples, everyone else there are the immigrant, the conquered, or the stolen, right? And so many are searching and longing for a culture and identity that was ripped away, or that they were forced or pressured to give up.
Sure.
Here, people are holding on to cultures and identity they've had for hundreds of years on their home territory. And that's even true for immigrants who are coming, from Senegal, from Nigeria. They know exactly their family history. They're coming with those stories intact. So multiculturalism here looks a little different, because now it's people trying to hold on to something very specific, whereas they're longing for something and creating something new. So that's a very, very different space for conversation too. I don't know if that made sense. A little hard to articulate.
It does. It does make sense. Patty, we've seen you twice now on the show singing, but we have a clip of you singing with, I believe, some students. I want to know if they are students, and where did you get the name 10,000 Glasses of Rage. So let's watch a clip of you singing that song with the students and give us some history around the evolution of the song 10,000 Glasses of Rage.
Mama did her best and she raised me right. Daddy was a strong, steady guy. I paid close attention to what they said, but I saw pain in their eyes. When they said, baby boy, be careful, they'll look at you, assuming that you're up to no good. Don't look them in the eye and don't talk back, and please don't ever wear your hood. There's a flavor on my tongue, it's just not right. A bitter taste that lasts and stays. A thirst that can't be quenched with angry words. And 10,000 glasses of rage, 10,000 glasses of rage.
That's just a little bit of it, just a little beautiful, beautiful song. People, please go to Patti DeRosa's YouTube channel where you can see that song and a number of her other songs. Powerful YouTube channel. Should they just go to Patti DeRosa?
Patti DeRosa Music.
Patti DeRosa Music YouTube channel. Patti, the evolution of that song and the students?
Yep. I just want to acknowledge, tell the writer, the questioner, I will come back to their question because I saw it. So that song, actually, I was teaching at Simmons Graduate School of Social Work, where I taught for over 20 years, of course, on dynamics of racism, actually helped to create the course. And this was, we actually created an online version right before I moved to Italy, actually, before everyone was online. They did a really cool thing. So these were two of my students that had been in the class the semester before. And we had been talking, it was right after, around the time of Trayvon Martin's murder, and a young man named Jordan Davis at a Florida gas station who was heard that he was playing his music loud, and a white vigilante that came in. So there, and all the, you know, every week after week after week, we're hearing stories. So I had this song just like sitting in my chest for a long time. And then in class, Walter and Ben had been talking, and Walter sharing really passionately around his own experience as a Black man and his concern for his young nephew, who was the same age as Jordan Davis, and the fear he carries around that. And then Ben talked about being a young white guy hanging out in a bar in Jamaica Plain and drinking. And then his friends, as his consciousness has been raised, his friends were saying things and how enraged he got, and how he just finally at one point, he's like, and I just blew up, you know, like, and how'd that go for you, Ben? And it didn't go so good. So it's like, how much had you been drinking? And what he said was 10, maybe a few glasses of beer, but 10 glasses of rage.
Wow.
And so that then became 10,000 Glasses of Rage. So those two concepts came together, and it turns out they were both musicians. So they sat in with me when we recorded. I wrote the song and we recorded it, and it was in the class. They used it in the class.
Multi-talented. Let's go back into the chat room. It says, how have Salvini and Maloney influenced Italy's perception of immigrants? Do you see any similarities in Italy and America anti-immigration views?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this. I mean, in general, as Mary said, like these issues are global and how I need even a bigger frame. So Salvini and Maloney are leaders of the far right-wing movements here. One's La Lega, the other one's called the Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy. They're extremely on the right, proto-neo-fascists. I don't know what neo means. Fascist is fascist, right? Another euphemism. Very strongly anti-immigrant. They are actually using racialized language, which is actually quite unusual here, that the language of race, where people will talk about Black people, whiteness is not often talked about, but some of these folks have actually started using that. And then when they get called on it, oh no, I just mean we need to preserve our culture, and there's all that framing. So let me say, the patterns are pretty clear, whether it's here, whether it's in the US, whether it's in any other country. We know what the patterns of the languaging that happens around anti-immigrant stuff. It's around talking about them as dangerous. It's talking about them, and the words start escalating as invaders, as you know, illegals, all these kinds of words used. And then eventually it gets to more dehumanizing terms about infestations. There's a whole trajectory that, you know, sociologists will talk, and we're hearing that here, of course. Italy, there's a huge, say this, huge numbers of immigrants and refugees, particularly coming from Africa, as well as the Middle East, and as well as Eastern Europe. That's a whole nother piece here that was new for me to understand some of the dynamics and long-term prejudices with Eastern Europeans too. But there's social crises happening in all these places, some around climate change, some around politics, and some of it is colonialism coming home to root. Like, you messed up these nations for so long. Are you wondering why folks are coming to look for a better life here, right? So yeah, the rhetoric's similar. All of us here are very concerned around the political situation. It's more complicated. We got a lot of political parties here, not just two, but it is tied, and they are tied into folks like Steve Bannon and all those folks. I mean, Bannon tried to open up a school here, a training school for leaders. So there's a global movement that's tied into authoritarianism, with racism as one of its tools for ascendancy. So it's all connected.
And who are your clients? And pre-pandemic, were you going back and forth from the States to Italy?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
who are your clients? How's work now? And if people want to hire you, how can they reach you?
Mm-hmm. Come over to Italy for a little now. You know, over the years, I've worked with, say, a bunch of different buckets, right? So my roots are in healthcare and human services as a social worker. I did a lot of work with corporations, a lot of work in education from preschool up to higher ed and everywhere in between, as well as community groups, government. So I like that I've been able to get that cross-pollination. I'd say the last few years before I moved here, I was working more and more with schools. The corporate work I enjoyed at some levels, but it was limiting in a lot of ways. Well, it wasn't. Got a lot of thoughts on that. It's another conversation. That could be a good conversation, like what it means to do equity work, diversity work in different contexts. But I was working mostly with schools and educators. And yeah, when I first moved here, enough of my clients were still interested in continuing the work. So twice a year, I would go back for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, work with a bunch of people in that time, and then come back and live here. On the interim, I wasn't working that much. The work here is very much in its infancy. Organizations are just starting to have the conversation, and there's a bit of it, oh, that's an American thing. But there are others, a lot of like the study abroad programs. I'm going to be doing something soon with a study abroad program, but most of those schools closed down, right? Because the students from abroad couldn't come. So my Italian is okay. It's not functional enough to do high professional work, and certainly around this kind of work, which is so sensitive. So it's mixed, I've been doing some work online. But if people are interested, certainly, Jim, I don't know if you can post my email or whatever.
Just give us the website and we'll put it up there.
Yeah, my website is another thing. I really haven't updated in a long time.
Give us there's
some good information there. But
give us the email. We'll put it up there.
I'll put them both up. Yeah, I'll give that to you later. So yeah, certainly get in touch. I can work remotely, and I still, I'll probably be back in the U.S. this summer. Again, when I get requests, I kind of see if there's enough in the same time frame, and then plan a trip.
Patti, you mentioned this work being so sensitive. There are a lot of pejoratives out there, and one that I still hear from time to time in doing the work is reverse discrimination. What's that?
I don't know. What is that? I'm not supposed to swear. And I mean, it's a misnomer, right? Again, a lot of these phrases, I think we have to be mindful that they are creations by the conservative thinkers and those who are seekers of justice and equity to trip us up. And I think sometimes we get caught in their game, all right? Even political correctness is another one. I'll come back to that. So reverse discrimination. Look, discrimination is discrimination. Right? So it means that cutting out of one group gets access, one group doesn't. There's no reverse about it. If you want to reverse it, I remember there was a comedian, I forget his name. He did a great piece though. He's like, yeah, you want to reverse it? Sure. When he goes back to like, conquering of the Americas, enslavement, and goes, so if you want to reverse racism, you'd have to reverse all that. It's not that I applied for this job and I just didn't get it. And of course, that's assuming it was your job to be had anyway. So there's lots of ways to deconstruct it. But I first said, what's the reverse mean? Because then it means, what does it mean without the reverse? So I often will ask questions. I don't understand what you mean by that. Help me, and break that down. But we have to be mindful of, there's a lot of words right now, politically correctness, even cancel culture. These words have taken on a life of their own and taken them out of the context where they started. And then we use them, and then we kind of feed into the very thing.
What are your views on Black History Month? We're February again, 2022 now. Views?
Go back to my two hands again. So until Black history is totally immersed and acknowledged as foundational to American history, or wherever we are, we do have a Black History Month in Florence. I'll tell you about that too. But until that's foundational in the way that we teach not just history, but all subjects in a way that's equitable and inclusive of who we really are as a people, as a nation, we need to have a month to focus on it. So that's really important. But isn't okay it's having it, February 28th, up March 1st, take down all the posters, take all the, that sort of trivialized tokenistic approach. It's better than nothing, but it's, we have Women's History Month, we have this. Again, it begs the question, then what's the rest of the year? It's White History Year, Male History Year, etc. So there's an and both. So yeah, the more we can learn, I have some good friends here, 2 African-American men who started Black History Month in Florence about 5 years ago. It's now, they have an amazing amount of activities going on, and it's spread to other cities in Italy. So that's really exciting. And it takes a little bit more of a diaspora perspective because so much of, although there's certainly Black Italians born and raised here, a lot of that has come from different nations in Africa and different parts of Europe, right? Because Europe is multicultural. We have this image of Europe. That's another thing in US language, and we talk about like Europeans. Well, Europeans come in all different shades too, and we got to remember that. And not just white folks. So.
Patti, our time has flown by, 60 minutes. Wow. Before we let you go, though, it's traditional in this show that we ask our guests to finish with a 30-second mini, M-I-N-I, a 30-second mini keynote. You grabbing the mic, you leaning into the camera and sharing your thoughts on what you'd like for us to consider going forward based on diversity, equity, inclusion, personal power, authenticity. It's Patti encouraging us around the topic that you choose for us to have a prosperous 2022 and beyond. So Patti D, mic check, 30 seconds, lean in, talk to you.
This, man, this is what happens. You have a good friend sets you up, man. Think of that old phrase, if not now, when? If not us, then who? And that's it. This is our world, our planet, and that's a bigger issue of the context of climate change and where that all fits into it. And it's up to us, right? We can't wait for someone else. I hear people say, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. Say something, do something. Every little ripple in that pond makes a difference. I believe there are lovers of justice and equity and seeking freedom. And people are fighting for justice all over the world. Many have been inspired by the struggles in the US. Sometimes in the US, we feel like, oh, we're so stuck. And others are like, oh, they're moving so far ahead. So it gives perspective sometimes. Yeah. So speak with heart, speak with authenticity. Overall, come from a place of love, because if you don't love somebody, why should I even listen to you, right? Martin Luther King talked about having the strength to love and being able to see allies when in the moment they may not appear to be allies. Because as one of my mentors said to me, when there were white activists who didn't want to go to a part of Boston that was known to be very racist. And he said, well, are you better than them? What made you think, what made you want to change and grow? And why don't you believe that they have the same capacity? Because if you don't believe they have the same capacity, this may not be the right movement for you. So that's that humbleness of belief. Now, there may be some that might say, this is going to take more time than I got, but there's a large majority of people that we can move. And I think in the US right now, it's a very urgent time around the struggle for racial justice, but around the struggle for democracy, as imperfect as it is in the US. There's some very profound things teetering on the edge, and it's going to take everyone. And we have the numbers, which is why they're trying to suppress so many votes, because they know that. We are the ones who have to believe that we have the power to make the changes.
Mic drop, Patti DeRosa. What a treat. What a treat. All the way from Florence, Italy. Thank you for making the time. Thank you for the enlightenment. Thank you for you being you and the music, and just, we wish you continued success as you continue to be that advocate for social justice and equality and diversity and inclusion. So thank you so much. Everyone else who's joining in, we'll see you again next week. Please bring folks with you. We want to get people fired up about inclusion, about diversity, about leadership, about life. So spread the word and don't forget, you've just been impacted. Take care.
Ciao.